Okay, so welcome everyone. We are so excited to have you with us today for this session. My name is Helen Chen. I've seen many of you in various sessions before. Really delighted to have you with us. I'm going to go ahead before we get started is just put in one more plug for the April 2020 Shark Tank ePortfolio edition. I hope everyone is excited about this because we certainly are. We still have a few more slots open, looking for a few more bites of people who might want to participate. I will say that, I don't want this to, hopefully you haven't given the impression that this is some kind of high stakes thing. It's really not, even though you will be swimming with sharks. We have some great experts lined up to provide just feedback on any sort of idea, whether it's for a research project or some sort of tweak you want to make, or, again, as we're all transitioning to the new conditions, of the fall, being online, being hybrid, being, a combination of both and so on. This is an opportunity to test out some ideas, really that in and of itself is an innovation. And so we really want to encourage people to really just bring an idea to us and have an opportunity to just get some feedback. And so we have really a great lineup. And again, would be happy to answer any questions that any of you might have. So I'm really delighted today, if we go to the next slide, to be joined by my colleagues and with my colleagues from the Integrative Learning Portfolio Lab at Stanford. We're housed within the Stanford Career Education beam. And so I'm joined by my co-presenter today, Dr. Sheetal Patel, as well as our additional colleagues, Janae Cohn and Margot Gilliland. Both, also will be available in the chat to answer any questions that you may have. Our topic today is actually addressing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging issues, as well as questions that might come up when students are creating portfolios, particularly showcase portfolios or portfolios aimed at external audiences. And what kinds of questions we've heard that we want to share with you, but also want to actually have a chance to be able to crowdsource not only questions, but as well as some strategies for how we address them. We go to the next slide. Here we'll talk a little bit just around logistics. We really want this to be an interactive session, and so we'll be taking full advantage of the chat as well as the breakout rooms. Some of the resources that we'll be collectively putting together, we will be sharing and making it available. And then in the interest of a good assessment, we will also have a feedback survey available too. All right, so in the next slide then, here we want to talk about sort of our mindset for today's session. And, we certainly recognize that it's a different world that we're living in these days, and we're certainly all learning. We're all trying to adopt a growth mindset. Our aspiration for today is really create a safe space for us to be able to talk about some of these challenging issues, especially around diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging, and so on. And we hope that you'll come to this with a sense of curiosity and also co-creation, because certainly no one has the answer here. Sheetal put up this great graphic here talking about where we might start, this idea of unconscious incompetence, being unaware of the skill and your lack of proficiency. And certainly, I know, speaking for myself personally, this is a challenging time, from the circumstances that we're dealing with the global pandemic, but also the protests and the concerns around mental health and well-being, particularly of our students. We're hoping to move more towards conscious incompetence. You're aware of the skill, but not yet proficient. And again, in putting this forward, one thing I want to say is that we don't have all the answers here. And that's why we want to bring this to have this discussion. Conscious competence, that, you're able to use the skill, but only with effort. And, that's part of today's session in terms of having some opportunity to do some strategizing and sharing of ideas to help us bring us to that place. And of course, our aspiration is that idea of unconscious competence. Performing the skill really becomes automatic. So if we go on to the next slide, then I do want to talk a little bit about the Integrative Learning Portfolio Lab. Again, our focus really is this recognition that students have a story to tell, one that really allows them to take a more holistic perspective, to bring in the different parts of who they are, their whole selves. And our lab really offers workshops, talks, programs, as well as courses, and more recently, professional development opportunities to be able to help students really communicate their identity and really to empower them to tell the story about who they are. But increasingly, we're also, a large part of our effort is also focused on helping faculty, administrators, other professionals, ePortfolio practitioners to be able to think about strategies and approaches for working with their students and so on. And that's certainly the curriculum development piece. As a lab, we're also developing some of these professional development opportunities, which we'll be able to share a little bit more later on. All right. So our agenda for today, again, we would like to start with some of the challenges that we see our students facing, and then really kind of talk a little bit more about the idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging relative to a digital presence, as well as the ePortfolio framework, and we see an intersection among those three areas. We'll be having a few breakout sessions so that all of you can also begin to brainstorm some of the questions that you've seen or heard or you imagine your students are facing, and then also taking the time to really think about how strategies and approaches for which we can better guide our students. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to my colleague Sheetal to take us forward.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you today to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the digital space when we're thinking about ePortfolios. Just a couple of two notes. I share space with my two daughters and my husband, so if one of those things happens, just please be patient with me. And also, as we've been in the space of virtual world, typically when I speak, I never have notes, but now in the virtual world, I feel like I need them. So you may see me look down at my notes. Again, just patience. So we'd love to talk first about some of the challenges, and perhaps you've faced some of these challenges before. We encourage you to use the chat if you have or have different perspectives that you want to share. We're going to keep that going throughout, and I'll kind of mention some of those spaces. This is one. So in today's world, we really can't avoid being online, especially today. So despite any issues we might have trying to help students be online, put their ePortfolios online, put ourselves and our identity online, and have that digital footprint, it's even bigger now. We have a bigger footprint. We're interacting more, and whether we're curating or not, it's there. And so students need to feel like they have a chance to reclaim and understand and have agency when they interact and engage in this space. They can feel like they don't have room to ask for privacy or create boundaries. And part of our goal is we want to be able to help students opt in, reclaim that, and not feel like someone else is controlling that or an algorithm is controlling that. But sometimes what happens is actually students, when they put their identity online, they struggle with that, especially when it comes to showcase portfolios like finding a job, right? That's the purpose of their portfolio. And they may approach that with a deficit approach. So they eliminate aspects of their identity, which can be dehumanizing as well. And so what we want to do is think about having them take a strengths approach. But that's a challenge in terms of trying to make this shift. And then additionally, you know, these are just a couple of the issues that are coming around that are related to DEI&B online. So for instance, you know, the platforms they're going to be on, are they thinking about bias online and how those platforms feed into that? When it comes to underrepresented first gen who are more affected, and they may not even have the tools or be on the same, you know, grounds with having tools. And if we are on campus, we can address some of that. Right? Campus can offer them the tools, we can offer them the resources, but in this environment, they don't necessarily have that same access. So the question really becomes, you know, how can we empower them to make strong cases for themselves? And as educators, you know, ultimately, we need to ask ourselves, you know, how do we help students put themselves online for various purposes? It could be career, professional, it could be educational, it could be personal, but how do we do that despite some of the DEI&B issues that are in the digital environment and present today? And so this is what we want to start to talk about, this biggest question of how do we educate and coach our students through that ePortfolio process, or in any way you help students be online. So we want to start by just talking, I'm flipping between screens and slides here, so just a second. So we want to think about first the framework, right? So we all have a common set of terms and language that we're talking about when we go into our breakout sessions and we're talking. So defining diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, not an easy thing. So we would love it if in the chat while I talk through this, you would add your own definitions and any analogies maybe that you use, that you've heard, questions. You can use the hashtag if you're referring to one of those, like hashtag diversity, hashtag equity, but we'll love for you to put in the chat how you define these or translate them online. But I'm just going to talk a little bit through what we talk, and I'll use an analogy that many of you may have heard already. So again, finding these isn't always easy. Different people define these different ways. But when we talk about diversity, I'm going to use the dance party. For those of you that have your video on, has anybody heard diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging explained through the dance party analogy? We have a few people that have. Okay, so add your own in the chat if you've got them. But we think about diversity as if we had a dance party. The diversity piece is everyone gets invited to the party, right? So they get invited. And so if we look at the actual definition, it's the different pieces of our identity that are actually like fact. So it might be age, it could be gender, it could be race. That's part of who I am. When we think about inclusion, if we're at this dance party, it means that everybody gets the opportunity to dance. So they're at the dance party, they got invited, but now they actually get that opportunity. And we think of inclusion then as a behavior. Right? If we get to belonging and we're at this dance party, we can think about that no matter how you dance, you're going to be accepted. You're going to feel like you belong once you are accepted. So if you're from my age range, if you did the Running Man, the Funky Chicken, the Twist, whatever you did, you're going to feel accepted and feel like you belong. And when we get to equity, I think this is where the conversation has shifted in the last few months, at least from my perspective. But equity, you know, in this analogy, people would describe it as saying, oh, equity is the piece where you get to be the DJ. But I think equity is actually much more than that. Equity means not just a chance to be the DJ, but getting the custom tools that you need to address inequality that would stop you from originally getting that opportunity as the DJ. So if we translate this online, I'm just gonna chat here. If we check this online, when we think about the online part, if we think about diversity, it's can I show the diverse parts of my identity? Can I show my gender? Can I show my race? Or should I cover and hide them? Right, back to that deficit approach. If I show up and if I show those diverse parts of my identity, what happens if I'm discluded or not included as part of that community if I'm trying to access it? And then let's say I do get discluded because of that. How is that actually going to make me feel? Like, am I going to have that sense of belonging or not? What are the emotional outcomes? And lastly, of course, first, even before any of this, could I have even accessed this community that's online? But also, what if I lose an opportunity, let's say a job opportunity, because of the elements that I show? And these are questions that the lab, all the instructors in our lab, for which Helen, Margot, Janae, and I have faced when we're in the classroom or we're doing a workshop when students come up and ask us, like, geez, I don't know exactly. And we're going to get into more of those questions. That gives you much. Helen, is there anything you want to point out maybe from the chat?
Sure. I just wanted to mention, and Boncha, if you want to talk about it, that'd be fine. Just say a few words. I mean, you put a link in there, so which is great.
Yeah, I actually recently came across this article from LinkedIn. It points, the author admits they are being maybe a little too nitpicky, but that the analogy assumes inherent passivity, like me as, you know, whatever, all the lovely diversity, intersectionality pieces I touch, like I need to be invited or asked to dance. And I like Sonia Taylor's comment, who is doing the inviting? I think the author is saying, why should we need to be invited? I scroll down at the bottom. At the end of that article, there are some kind of cool alternatives, like being a member of the party planning committee in the first place, that kind of thing.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing that. This is exactly what Helen and I were hoping for, that we could, for all of us to be able to share those things as we try to figure this out and guide our students. So thanks so much for sharing that. All right, we're gonna move to the next slide here. So in this slide, again, in the chat, we would love for you to share sort of on the more theories and scholarship, what are some of the ones that you've seen? I think this part, sort of gathering information on this particular piece in terms of those theories and scholarship can be somewhat challenging because we can call different things by different terms and different names depending on how you're coming at it. So if we think about, like, human-computer interaction, which is one aspect. If we think about critical cultural theory, like they all call these things different names. So please, as I talk through this, do add theory scholarships, things that you've come across or researched in the chat box. But what I wanted to point out here is that we do, from an academic standpoint, there are some larger macro theories that can help us understand the issues we're starting to speak about. And some of these examples are obvious and some of them are not. I'm not going to go through each of these, but I am going to share one example. So if we go back to talk about this deficit issue as a challenge, this has been talked about in terms of the term covering. So this is a business theory piece of scholarship, which largely has its focus on covering when we're in office. So it actually, or the workplace. So it states that we conceal something about oneself in order to avoid making other people feel uncomfortable or to lessen attention to a given characteristic. Now, this has been studied, like I said, in workplaces, but you could see that this definitely can apply to online. And we maybe, one of the examples in the workplace that often gets used is you might change your hair to match the majority because you're covering whatever your natural hair is, right? We could see this happen online. So I've seen students cover their names, right? Cover their photos. When we talk about what does a professional look like, inherent in that conversation is us asking students, right? Or those employers asking students to potentially cover parts of their identity. But what in fact does an engineer look like? What does this, surgeon look like? I don't know about all of you, but I've been hearing those stories come up, especially in the last few months. There was one OBGYN who got mistaken for being a nurse simply because of the race of her skin. And so they didn't realize that she was actually a doctor, right? There's all these things coming up. So students will cover depending on what they think they need to look like or be considered. And so I think as educators, if we're able to kind of bring some of these to light to be able to help talk about these, we can begin to have some of that conversation too. And I see we have one comment about forced covering. So did you want to mention anything on that?
Yeah, I brought up, have we all heard the story about the professor who had a Vietnamese student and he asked to anglicize his name?
Right.
I haven't heard that, but I've heard.
Oh, you have not?
No, I haven't personally.
Oh, the Vietnamese student's name was, I believe, Phuc Bui, H-U-C, new word, B-U-I. And there was some back and forth and some negative. I forgot if the professor stepped down or if he was relieved. It reminds me of this other personal anecdote. I was in a store a bunch of years ago. I asked the salesperson where a certain thing was, and he told me. I said, "Are you Thai? I think. Do I hear an accent?" He's like, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "My name is something. I don't remember." I said, and he said, "But they call me Paul." And I'm thinking, do they call you Paul or do you go by Paul? Those are two different things.
Yeah, absolutely. So we get that from our students a lot. I work with a lot of students, as they put their names up and they'll say like, wait, which name should I use? Should I use my American name or my whatever we get this from international students a lot from, Chinese students will say, oh, should I use my American name or my Chinese name? Same with Indian students. I've had them ask me that question personally. And these are those parts that, if we're asking them to put an ePortfolio online for showcases, as educators, we want to make sure we have some conversations with them so they can make some decisions. So we're aware of it as well. So going on, so we can get to these breakout rooms quickly, we want to talk about the process of ePortfolios and just give some examples of questions that come up along the way, because what we're going to ask you to do is brainstorm some of the questions that have come up for you or the things that you think are a concern that we can start to talk about as well. So when we, in the ILPL lab, when we talk with students about the process of creating ePortfolios, we break it down like this. We know lots of different people have different frameworks, so we're just sharing ours, but we first ask them to think about what's their story now, what's already out there about them, what's that digital footprint look like. One of the questions that comes up falls under what's called the social network gap. So like not even knowing you were supposed to be networking in the first place or even be online. So we've had, I've had grad students and undergrads come in and say, well, I didn't even know I was supposed to be here or have this, so I don't actually have anything up. And then there's a whole conversation of what happened there, right? When we get to purpose and audience, next we say, okay, once you've had your story, you have an idea what's up there, what's the purpose or the audience that you want to be, you want to have an ePortfolio for. So obviously there are learning ePortfolios. In this case, we're thinking about showcase portfolios. A lot of them are up there for job seeking, if it's our grad students for research purposes. And so their audience may be faculty, it may be employers. Well, what do we know there? That those, for different purposes and audiences, they expect different parts of you to look a certain way. So again, going back to covering, right? Should I use my real name? Should I use my American name? We then ask them to think through their story. So what's the story they want to put up? So we ask them to think through their experiences, and we ask them to inventory those experiences, think about themes, what are the values, what are the skills they've learned that they want to be able to talk about. And of course, I'm going through this really fast, so let me know if you have any questions along the way. One thing we've noticed here is a confidence issue. So the confidence to even tell that story. Do I have worthwhile experiences to translate? We had a female graduate student who had been a researcher on a project, had contributed beautifully and said, oh, I don't know that I have any experiences that I contributed here. And we needed to walk her through the fact, like, what did she actually do before she realized I had that contribution? So even from a gender perspective, right? Like, do I even have the confidence to tell my story and put that story online? When it gets to evidence, I think this is where things become a little bit more concrete in nature of students really running into this issue of what do I put online. So we ask students, okay, now that you have your story and your purpose and your audience, what evidence do you have to support that? So what are the projects, what are the experiences, skills that you want to showcase in support of that story? We can go back to photos here. So as people gather photos, do I want to show that photo? Because it shows my race, it shows my gender. I have tattoos, I'm not in a suit the way that I think people expect. And I know we're talking about some surface level and then some deeper things. So I'm just giving a few quick examples. I'm not saying this is at all inclusive of everything. And I think that's what we're hoping to get to, is all the issues here. And then lastly, once you know that, what channel do you want to use to put that online? So ePortfolios, they may, university may have its own system. We actually, in the ILPL, we allow students to choose their platform where they want to put that. But do they even have access to these channels? Do they have the Wi-Fi and tech to create, an ePortfolio, or if they choose to put their, portfolio in a LinkedIn place, do they have access, is that platform accessible to neurodiverse audiences? Do they have the privacy they want, right? So there's all these different issues and questions that come up along the way in relation to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Helen, anything to add so far there?
No, I think maybe just a pause there to see if there are any questions before we move on to the next activity.
All right.
Okay.
So we're going to move into our first breakout. And so what we would love to do here is we're going to do a few things. I'm going to explain all the instructions first, and then we'll break you out. So first of all, here's the prompt that you'll be working on. In your work with students, what questions do you hear? Or if you haven't been thinking about this, or you've been not working with students, maybe, we know there's different types of folks that have different types of programs. What do you think they are concerned about when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging issues in the ePortfolio process? So we've thrown out a few, maybe some of the more obvious ones, but we'd love to hear from you, especially because all of us work with different student populations as well. And those differences can certainly differ between those populations. So in the chat box, you'll see that there's a link that Helen's put in. That's going to lead you to a Google Doc where all of us will be recording our ideas so that all of us then have access after this, so you guys can take this with you. In your breakout rooms, we'll just ask you to introduce yourselves. The person with the last birthday will just ask you to be the scribe to type in as people brainstorm. So we'll give you about 10 minutes to brainstorm and take notes on this particular prompt. So it could be as simple as, here's a question that gets raised, here's a 2-word issue, I think, right? Whatever you want to brainstorm and put in there would be great. We want you to remember 2 things in this brainstorming session. This is a safe space. So, as we think about any brainstorming session, we want to use our yes and rule. So somebody may have an idea or a question, you may disagree or just, have a judgment about it, but we're going to say yes and move on to the next idea, so we can make sure that everyone has a chance to have those ideas be heard and recorded. And then as a group, decide if there's one or two questions you'd like to share, because we'd love to debrief for a moment after, before getting into our following activity. Are there any questions on that? Does that make sense so far? Looks like we're good. Okay, everybody, did anybody have trouble accessing the Google Doc through that bit.ly link? Don't see any shakes of heads or anything in the chat. All right, so Helen is gonna go ahead and break us off into our rooms, and we'll come back at about 12, I'm sorry, Pacific Standard Time. I forgot, everybody might be in different time zones, but we'll come back in about 10 minutes. So at least Pacific Standard Time will be about 12:38.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open all the rooms. Sheetal, it signed you, but you can go and just stay here.
Okay.
Okay, great. Here we go. Okay, welcome back, everyone.
Yeah.
We were saying we took it to be a good sign that no one came back early. You guys all had to get sucked back into the void.
Awesome. Welcome back. Welcome back. We hope, we know that's not a lot of time, obviously, but just a little bit of time to think through. Do we have one or two groups that want to share one of the things, one of the questions or issues that come up in the ePortfolio process? Can unmute your mic or raise your participant hand.
So our group asked a question about professionalism, the concept of professionalism and the bias that that term contains and indicates. And what are you really asking students to do if you tell them to be professional? And what are they asking if they're asking you, is this professional enough?
Yep, definitely a question that comes up. Thank you for sharing that. Is there one other group that wants to talk about one question they talked about?
In our group, it came up that now that some campuses are opening up or allow students to be on campus and others staying at home, that those with slow internet or no internet at home kind of are almost forced to go on campus and therefore are exposed to a greater risk of infection and therefore are disadvantaged in that. So how can you balance that? And kind of they don't even have a choice. And so that's an important question to tackle then on campus or at the university in general.
Yeah, and I think that not having a choice lends itself to the platform issues we have as well. So the platforms and the choice they give you in terms of how much agency and not agency, if you don't have time and you can't create your whole entire ePortfolio, but you want to use one that's templated, and then how much, I think choice is an interesting issue, or the lack thereof. I see one more hand. I'm trying to figure out the name that goes with the hand. Looks like, is it Sonia?
Yes. Yeah, that's me. We were kind of in mid-talk when we got pulled back. So I'll ask my colleagues to, add anything as they want. But one thing that really occurs to me is I work with a lot of first generation and historically marginalized students. And I'm a first generation student myself. And part of the issue, I think, is I don't know what question I need to ask. And for students, they don't know what the question is that they need to ask to get at those things. And so I don't know if there's any answers in there, but that's one question that I think is
we're just talking about questions, so we don't need to have answers yet. We're gonna get to, and not answers but guidance. Okay, thank you so much for sharing all of that, and you guys can peruse the other breakout rooms and things that they came up with, but we're gonna go to our next activity with our last section in time here. So the next thing we want to talk about is not just talking about the problem, right? Just the questions that come up in issues, but how do we as educators then begin to think about ways to help our students through this process? And so I'm going to just give you a couple of examples and strategies we've talked with the student populations we work with, just as an example, so that just to give you like a warm up as you try to think about, okay, what are the strategies I have used? What are things that might, or just, try to think more generally. So one of the populations that we work with is international students. We have a large population of international students. And one of the things that comes up, well, actually there's a multitude of things that come up when international students are trying to put themselves online or create that ePortfolio. So for example, if you're in a different country and we talk about that first step of like, what's your story? They have different search engines, different channels, different algorithms that are tracking them in different ways. And that also goes to how they are allowed to show up too. There's certain countries where self-promotion isn't something that's like taken with the culture. And so the larger issue I think sometimes here is going back to thinking about acculturation and assimilation, right? Meaning how much do you take on of the majority's culture? And how does that work? There are different cultural norms that they're facing if they're going back or if they're staying here, right? And they may or may not, as Sonia pointed out, be aware of some of those rules that apply and don't apply. So in our case, there's a few things we do as students. First of all, we ask them to talk with their peers, other people at school. We give them that space, especially in our course, to get feedback. We ask them like, who are the people you want to role model? What is your, thinking through their purpose. However, that doesn't necessarily solve the issue when they're making decisions because there's biases already out there in the system. So if they find a role model who has covered their name or uses a different research name, right, then that just actually perpetuates the issue. So we do ask them to do those things, but we also try to think through and talk about some of these things that might come up. So to the point of like, I didn't even know I was supposed to pay attention to that, to make sure that they are actually thinking about some of those things and getting feedback and talking to multiple people to figure out what does that profile need to look like. The next thing though is we don't, as educators, as much as we'd love to protect our students and help them, we don't necessarily have control of the structures, platforms, and institutions students are using or are being forced without choice to have to use to play in different environments to get opportunities. So what do we do when we know the system is biased, but they have to put something up or they feel like they have to? And so it's in these important situations that Helen and I try to talk about this, and the rest of the members of the ILP Lab, which is not to answer from our own value system, but to make sure we're helping students understand their own values and then give them agency and be able to help them make informed values. So for instance, if a student does ask, should I put my real name or my anglicized or American name on there? And if I answered for my own value and my own privilege, I might say, well, use your real name because you don't want to work for people that are biased and would make those decisions based on your race. But that's my value of authenticity, but it's also the space I'm in right now in my life where I can make that decision. However, out of college, I did not make that decision. There were some points where I made different decisions, absolutely didn't do that. I hid all sorts of parts of my own identity. When I was on the faculty job, like the job search, when I became faculty, I hid the fact that I was married to deal with that conversation because I already had to contend with race and gender. I had illegal questions asked in my interviews. And so I didn't even want to bring that part of my identity into it. But I don't want to answer from that space, right? Those are my places. So if people have heard, there's like now the platinum rule versus the gold, like golden rules, treat others how you want to be treated. Platinum rule, treat others how they want to be treated. And this goes to that, right? So figure that out, help the student figure that out. So what's the student, what's their values? What's right for them? And so what we try to do is take them through a couple activities. We try to go through values with them. So we have something called the Meaningful Work Kit where we, that was developed at Beam in the career education where ILPL, Margot, who's on the call right now, helped develop that. But we take them through this values exercise so they can understand what are their top 5 values and have some conversations around that, and then use that to help make those decisions. And then we also use a coaching approach with our one-on-ones, which is more asking questions around this versus giving them teaching, giving a lecture, giving answers, but actually asking questions and helping them think through that. Obviously, these are just a couple examples. What we're hoping is that we can get lots more information from each other and from each other's experiences. So we're going to go into our second breakout room. And we're going to ask you to go back to some of the issues that you brought up. And given those questions and topics that you've generated, what are some of the strategies and approaches that educators can use to guide and support students? And remember, educators could be faculty, could be advisors, could be mentors, could be staff. And when we talk about strategies and approaches, we're thinking about what are, could be prompts, questions to ask the student in return, ways to respond, exercises, resources, examples, or stories that you have from other students. But keep in mind, we want to think about how we respond too. So that might be another thing you think through, is how do we demonstrate empathy for our students in this experience. So you're going to kind of follow the same instructions where I think, Helen, are we able to go back to this? So we're going to put you back in the same breakout rooms. And so even there in the document, you'll see there's a brainstorm part 2. You can just keep brainstorming where you were, but just make it clear that here are some of the approaches, or you can go to the second part, which says brainstorming part 2, and go to your breakout room and put down so those approaches. Again, you won't need to introduce yourself. You've already introduced yourself and you may already have a scribe. You'll have 10 minutes about ish. Yes, yeah, well, probably a little less than 10 minutes since it's 12:50. And again, remember, this is a safe space, yes, and I'm not sure if we'll have time to share, but if there's one, we will. So go, Helen, if you want to go ahead and take us out.
Okay. Hey, Megan, thanks so much for your comment about, I'm curious as to if you had any examples of like, when people mention professionalism, what did they say? Or what did you guys talk about?
So from my context, I talked about how like within a lot of my students view professionalism as primarily whiteness, as acting white, as it were. And in some ways it is. I mean, there's no doubt about it. If they have to change their language from AAVE to SAE, that is whitening their language, as it were.
Yeah.
Same thing with like how their profile actually appears, what kind of things they put on it. Those are the questions they're asking themselves.
Yes, yes. And Sheetal, I mentioned, Megan, to you, we had this great conversation, and especially relevant to concerns about LinkedIn and what do they include their name? Do they include their, all of those things I think have come up. Yeah.
Now, I've had some students who work at the college and will ask if they should even put that on there because they're concerned an employer will see HBCU and then know their identity.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
So even that level.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that level of awareness, and like also just what to, versus just like, oh, I just put it up there, I don't think about it. So they're very aware of like, what are the potential implications, how other people might view them because of that and everything.
Yeah, it's a constant awareness, and it's something I didn't as a white person, I did not understand until I'd worked here for quite some time. And I've talked to students and faculty and everybody so many times about this that you realize that it's like a soup. It's like you live in it and it's constant and it's,
Absolutely.
every day.
Well, thank you. Welcome back. I just have a few minutes to wrap up here with you. So we just, we know that wasn't much time, but we sort of just wanted to say, first of all, we kind of tried to set some frameworks here to have some of this conversation. We hope that's helpful to you. There's at least some issues, questions, potentially some strategies in there that you can take the Google Doc with you. But we hope this is, I think I made an assumption here in putting first. This might not be your first conversation. This could be like your 20th conversation, but it should be one of many. So we I gave you like less than 10 minutes on that last one, but I hope that this, we continue to have this conversation and have these conversations to exchange what is it that's working for you, so that we can be able to better this. And I think like we just don't have these conversations often, and so I'd love to see that happen more so with Helen and the rest of the members. So in that vein, we are going to have a virtual workshop where we actually dive deeper to actually design some strategies for your particular student population. Going forward. So Helen's going to put in the box the link for feedback. There's just 3 or 4 questions. It's kind of first time we've run run this, and we would love to know what was helpful, what was not helpful. And then also in there is Helen's email if you want to email her for more information on that workshop, or you can put your email in. We didn't want you to feel like you had to match your email with your feedback if you didn't want to, so you have both choices. So Helen, do you have that link in there?
Yeah, I'm just need to fix it because I think I didn't put the appropriate setting, so I'm going to fix it right now.
Sorry.
Sorry.
All right, so we'll have this workshop. Please do, we would love to see anybody that could come and so we can begin to, again, have some more sophisticated strategies, approaches that we can take to more thought, like, you know, designed out for those populations that you could take back to. And then, you know, feel free to contact me or Helen. We would love to hear from you. We'd love to have more of these conversations. So with our lab members that have been on, you see the bit.ly link there. Please do sign in. Helen, what am I missing at this point? Is there anything you want to add?
No, so try the link again, see if that would work. Sorry about that. Thank you guys so much, because this is, again, our first chance to kind of share some of these ideas, and really want to be able to crowdsource with all of you. Again, we hope this will be the first of many conversations, and really appreciate your taking the time to spend with us and also begin to brainstorm. Sheetal and I will hang around for a little bit if anyone would like to have any follow-up questions or conversations about some of these topics. Again, we're just hitting we're just scratching the surface here and everything, and there's so much more. And if we think about back to that slide with the different mindsets and so on, I mean, where we're aspiring to go, we're certainly at the very beginning of this. So it will take us all, a while before this becomes unconscious competence in these areas. So we'll just all figure it out together. So thank you guys so much.
Great. We'll hang around for any questions or conversations anybody wants to have.